Well, hello, this is Adam, and welcome back to Rare Classic Cars. Today we're going to talk about a topic that's near and dear to my heart, and I know is near and dear to a number of your hearts as well, and that is what happened to Pontiac, and is it ever coming back? So let's talk about that, and we're not on the porch here because it's super cold and windy outside. So we're inside, and there's less wind noise as well, too, as a result. We'll get back to the porch eventually here. Nonetheless, I got the whiteboard, and we're going to talk about three things with respect to Pontiac: sales, profitability, and the dealer network. We're going to focus on those three things as we answer that question: what happened to Pontiac, and will it come back? So let's talk about sales first. And the first thing to remember is that Pontiac sales dropped precipitously as the 2000s went on. And actually, the best years for sales for Pontiac, I'll put in a chart here on the screen, were 1968, 1978, and 1986. Now, the first of those years, you might say 1968, well, that makes sense, right? The GTO was revised that year. The Firebird was pretty new, and it just come out the year before. You had really attractive full-size vehicles, mid-size cars, and you also had a new Grand Prix for 1 year only, too. So that makes sense. 68 was a really good year for Pontiac. I think a lot of us would say, those were great cars. 78 is interesting because it's not one of those years that sticks out in your head as a Pontiac fan. That, boy, you got to get that 78 Pontiac. But really, it was a great year on the back of the Firebird and the downsized full-size vehicles that GM had introduced in 1977, including the Caprice and Impala, as well as the Bonneville, Catalina, and the old side, the 88, 98, and on the Buick side, the LeSabre and Electra. And Pontiac really capitalized on that. Their full-size vehicles were a home run, and in general, that downsizing for General Motors was a home run. So 1978 was consequently another great year for Pontiac. And then 1986 is another year where you kind of scratch your head and say, 1986, top Pontiac sales year? But it was. They really had everything humming across the lineup, from the Sunbird to the 6000 to the Firebird to, the then, let's call it, somewhat downsized, intermediate-sized Bonneville that was still a rear-wheel drive car. The front-wheel drive Bonneville wouldn't come out until 87. Of course, the Grand Ams and Grand Prix. It was all really working for Pontiac in 1986, 1 year before they redid the Bonneville and transitioned it to front-wheel drive. And of course, they had the Parisienne in 1986, which was really nothing more than a rebadged Caprice that Pontiac imported to the U.S. because they had decided several years prior that the Bonneville nameplate was going to go from GM's full-size platform to being an intermediate car, when they thought that fuel prices were going to be $5 a gallon in the 80s. And then as fuel prices started to drop in real dollars, Pontiac realized that it needed really to fill that lineup, and they imported the Parisienne from Canada, where it had been sold for a long time. And in each of those years, though, 1968, 1978, 1986, Pontiac sold between 800 and 9,000 cars a year, and most years touching the 68 and 78, touching almost at 900,000 units of sales. Just great years. But by the early 2000s, all that had changed. Pontiac sales plummeted from that 1986 point. Again, take a look at the graph here. Plummeted from 1986 down as the U.S. entered a recession in the early 90s, then recovered and kind of plateaued throughout the 90s at the 500 to 600,000 unit mark. And then after 2003, breaking through on the way down the 500,000 unit mark, and then dropping precipitously to the 176,000 unit sales they had in their final model year. And what really happened at that point is once you start breaking through that sub 500,000 unit sales, it becomes really challenging forget about the company for the moment, but for the dealers to make money on the brand. So dealers tend to make $3,000 to $5,000 a car in normal times. This is not normal times, by the way, with supply constraints, so presumably they're making more right now on a per vehicle basis. But, you think about 500,000 units of sales and a dealer network that was probably numbering a couple thousand-ish at that point. So dealers are making, let's say, on average, if there's 2,000 dealers, 500,000 unit sales, they're each selling 250 cars per year. And let's take the low end of that range, $3,000 a car, $750,000 a year in profit. It sounds like a lot, but when you think about the amount of capital expenditures that are required to put into dealerships, from re-imaging the buildings to all of the equipment to service vehicles, it's really not that much. And once you start dipping down into the, let's call it $500,000 of profitability per dealer, per brand, then you're really kind of sunk. Because remember, that's an average number, meaning that some dealers are above that and quite a few dealers are below that. Half of the dealers are below that. And those that are making a couple $100,000 a year off of their Pontiac franchise, it just doesn't mean anything. So the sales volumes got to the point where the dealers just really couldn't make a lot of money off of it. And more, also to that point, the company couldn't make money off of it. Think about the Pontiac lineup at the end of its life. You had the G3, the G5, the G6. Sure, you had the G8, but those really were not money-making vehicles for the company. And moreover, they didn't really excite the sales base that Pontiac had. In fact, I would say the transition from calling a vehicle the Grand Am to the G6 really alienated a bunch of customers. The Grand Am always sold 150 to 250,000 units per year. And it took the G6 a couple of years. It finally got to the 150,000 units of sales mark a few years after its launch, but it was really on the back of a lot of fleet sales, which the Grand Am did have a fair amount of fleet sales in its lifetime, but it did have a lot of retail sales as well. And you have to remember, the Grand Am was also a pretty old, basically N-car platform that had come out in the mid-1980s. So from a profitability standpoint, all of the underpinnings and a lot of the expense to make it was kind of sunk, if you will, and the car was making good money. When the G6 came out, there was a lot of revamp that happened. And, I think the other piece is the Pontiac styling really lost its mojo. That quote-unquote guardrail styling with, as John Manoogian described, all those ribs, they were gone. And GM management thought that they wanted to make Pontiac into a lower-priced BMW fighter. And to do that, they were envisioning this transition to rear-wheel drive architectures, really building the next generation of Pontiacs off of the Cadillac platforms, which now underpin the CT4, the CT5, and have underpinned the ATS and CTS. But those architectures were going to be more expensive than the front-wheel drive cars that they replaced. The cars also lost the ribs and some of that distinctive flair, and I think the GM management tried to push the designs more upmarket, and it lost something in translation. So if you really roll the tape forward on Pontiac and where it would have been if GM had followed through on making it this import BMW fighter, it actually would have failed even more miserably than it did, because it would have gone to more expensive architectures just as the market was transitioning away from cars into crossovers, SUVs, and pickups, which it is today. The market's only about 30% cars and 70% pickups, SUVs, and crossovers. So frankly, we all kind of bemoan Pontiac being lost, but where GM was headed with it was actually going to be worse from a profitability perspective than where it already was. And where it already was pretty bad. The G3, I would surmise the G3, the G5, the G6, and the G8 really didn't make any money. And in fact, they were probably variable profit losses. And what do I mean by that? It's really just a fancy term for when you're in business. When you have a variable loss, it means with each car you sell, you're actually losing more money. If you have a car that you can, let's say, is a variable profit, makes money at a variable profit level, then you start to defray all your fixed costs, your overheads, like your rent, your utilities, your taxes, and those things. But these cars couldn't even pay for the variable costs associated with them, much less help GM defray all the fixed costs. So toward the end of the lineup, there really just wasn't anything that was making any money either. Yeah, Pontiac did have the Torrent for a few years in those late 2000s. It was a rebadged Equinox. Probably made a few bucks on that, but it really wasn't a home run either. So Pontiac had a number of fatal issues toward the end. The sales were plummeting fast as divisional and GM management tried to make it into this import BMW fighter that changed its image, changed its customer base, and also was going to transition it to more costly architectures. So that future was pretty grim, and doing so all at the same time that the US auto market was pivoting more and more toward crossovers. Hence, I think actually the decision to save Buick was the right one, because Buick was already pivoting toward crossovers with the Enclave back then, which was a home run. The Encore was not far behind, and they had a bunch of China volume to protect. Pontiac didn't have that, although Pontiac did have a lot of Canada-based volume, about 150,000 units per year there, that it was the mainstream brand in Canada for many, many years. For those who aren't aware, in Canada, Pontiac was the mainstream brand, not Chevrolet. And when I say they sold 150,000 units per year in Canada, the Canadian market's about a tenth the size of the US. So it's the equivalent of selling 1.5 million units in the US. It was just a tremendously huge brand, but GM decided to sunset it, and a lot of those Pontiac dealers became Hyundai Kia dealers in Canada, and they're gone. So is Pontiac ever going to come back? Kind of explain why it went out. Declining sales, bad profitability, tough for dealers to make money, so the profitability is not just at the company level, but also at the dealer level. And it's not going to come back. And I think, first of all, imagine what Pontiac would have to come back as in order to make money. It would have to come back as a crossover brand. It could not come back as a division that made passenger cars, because nobody buys those hardly anymore, unless they're low-end, entry-level vehicles like Toyota Corollas and Honda Civics. The passenger car space in the US is dead. So it's not really going to appease any of us that love Pontiac to bring the brand back and have it launch a bunch of crossovers. That doesn't just feel right. I mean, it doesn't feel like it's Pontiac DNA. And beyond that, if you did that, who's going to sell it? And how do you have the dealer network to sell it? And how do you fund all of the marketing investments that have to be made and all of the engineering costs? Well, it's kind of similar to what happened at GM with Saturn when GM launched Saturn, and it effectively starved the resources from the other General Motors divisions at the time. You have to do the same with Pontiac, and launching a Pontiac anew, if you will, and you'd have to, as I said, have it focus on crossovers. So you're already disconnected from what we all loved about Pontiac heritage. Then you'd have to starve the other GM divisions of marketing expense as well as engineering resources to fund something that all of us, when we would see the products come out, would kind of say, meh, that's not the Pontiac I remember. So no, it's not going to come back. And it would be very tough. You couldn't sell it through standalone dealerships because the volume would be too little. It'd be something like GMC is doing with Hummer right now. There's no more Hummer standalone dealerships. They're all going to be sold through GMC dealerships. So then dealers have to be incentivized basically to put resources on those cars above and beyond the resources they're putting on the whole rest of the portfolio. And I think Pontiac would just get crowded out in the showroom. There wouldn't be a place for it. And none of us would get all that excited about seeing a bunch of Pontiac crossovers. So sadly, it's not coming back. But that doesn't mean that there aren't a lot of Pontiacs out there that you can still buy. There are fewer every year, just because as time goes on, some vehicles are lost to history. But, I would say, for me, the halcyon days of Pontiac are really that mid-60s to late 60s time frame. And those cars are still out there. And if you don't want a muscle car, like I have a Bonneville and a Catalina from that vintage, they're phenomenal. And I'd highly encourage anybody who wants a vintage Pontiac, look at that mid to late 60s time frame. They are just stellar cars. And celebrate Pontiac that way, because it's not coming back. Hope you enjoyed this discussion on Pontiac and the overall brand, its past and its future. If you did, we could do more on other brands. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and check out the video thumbnails at bottom left and right for some suggestions for you.